This meeting will come to order. Today is Tuesday, October 31st, 2017. This is a special study session of the Prescott City Council. Roll call, please.
Mayor Olberg.
Here.
Pro Tem Lamerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Lizelle.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
She's here,
But not here.
She's not here at the moment.
Oh, we got a quorum.
We do have a quorum.
Okay. We'll go ahead and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance by the Mayor Pro Tem.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I want to thank everybody for turning out today for this study session. It'll be the first of maybe several more on this topic of approving the Deepwell Ranch Master Plan for the city of Prescott. I think I'd like to go ahead and open by making a few comments to kind of give us an idea where things are going, and then we'll proceed to have the staff provide probably a pretty lengthy briefing for us. We have the development team here from Deepwell Ranch that will answer questions as necessary. I will give about a 30-minute period for public comment toward the end. We're going to hold to the 2 hours today, and the last half hour will be for public comment. And if you do get up here and speak, please be conscious of the time that you're spending talking to us. We'd like to limit it to 5 minutes or less with your questions or comments. In this study session, we began reviewing a very complex development plan proposed by Ron James on 1,800 acres of Deepwell Ranch property that was previously annexed into the city of Prescott on October 2015. This 1,800 acres is part of an 18,000-acre Deepwell Ranch in total. Workshop sessions by the City Council are for fact-finding and providing information for members of the council on critical elements of issues facing the city and the residents of Prescott. Depending on subject matter and time available, public comment is sought to further inform the council of the public's view on the issues being discussed. Let me begin this review by saying that this master plan envisions a planned community which is viewed by city staff as an improvement over a more sequentially developed property that can result in less desirable integration between units upon final build-out. This plan proposes an urban center in North Prescott near the airport that contemplates an additional 10,500 residential units and associated commercial centers being built over the next 30 to 50 years. Under property rights provided by the U.S. Constitution, the property owner has the right to bring forward development of his or her property for city consideration. Equally important is the city's obligation to be guardians of the public trust and our obligation to ensure property development plans and agreements are consistent with city codes and ordinances, as well as the general plan, which was handily approved by city voters in August of 2015. The Deepwell Master Plan was development of this property was submitted to the city in June of 2017 and has been reviewed by city staff for many hundreds of hours. In addition, Prescott's Planning and Zoning Commission has conducted 7 meetings evaluating the master plan and rezoning request. After considerable discussion, the P&Z Commission voted 4-3 to recommend approval and forward this plan for City Council review and action. In its recommendation, P&Z provided 21 points for consideration to be addressed before approving the master plan and a subsequent development agreement with the city. The Deepwell Master Plan has generated considerable public comment that has been mostly exclusively negative, with many residents expressing concerns about availability of water, possible impact on airport operations, both near-term and future, the level of increased activity on Highways 89, 89A, and Willow Creek Road, and the significant change this development could impose on Prescott's history and culture. Due to the P&Z considerations and public comments just stated, I feel it is incumbent on the City Council to properly evaluate these concerns as we move forward to approve the Deepwell Master Plan and a development agreement. This study session is the first to begin that process. I fully understand that time is money and we need to complete this review in a timely manner to provide an answer for the owner one way or another and I'm not able to foresee a schedule at this time when this evaluation may be complete and ready for council vote. Finally, let me add that Deepwell Master Plan team has been very willing to work with the city staff since submission of the plan to resolve areas of disagreement and concern. And with such continued collaboration, I am confident that we can meet the future needs of Prescott and alleviate most of the public concern with this development. With that, I'll go to our staff to start the briefing. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Did you have something, Greg, that you
I
wanted
just did, Mr. Mayor, if I could.
Go ahead.
I know during your introduction statement there, you mentioned a timeline or a lack of, nothing permanent. I guess my question to the council and to staff, or primarily to council, do we foresee a decision with this current city council on this project?
Well, for me, I think we had a lot of information to cover here. There's been a lot of points, both from P&Z and from the public. I think they need to be evaluated. It's possible we can move through them fairly fast. Some of them may be repetitious, and when you answer one, you've answered many. I don't know. We'll have to take a look at that. But right now, I can't see that this can be completed with this council, but I'm not saying that it couldn't be.
Well, and my concern is if it's not, there could possibly be 4 new members up here. If it's not decided, then we're, for the sake of an informed council, this whole thing would have to be repeated for those 4 new council members. That's my only concern.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you.
Mayor and Council, good afternoon. I wanted to kind of set the stage about how this was going to proceed, at least from staff's perspective. Our hope was this would give you guys an opportunity, an educational opportunity to get up to speed. And I know a lot of you have done independent research, but all of you to be provided the same information at the same time about where this project is. And basically in your handouts on the second page is a breakdown of how we saw this going. The agenda for today is to look at the existing zoning and what the entitlement is as we sit here today, followed by an overview of the proposed master plan, what the applicant is asking. Also, a breakdown of what the Planning Commission's review and discussions were, an overview of their approval with the 21 caveats or restrictions, or conditions, I guess is the better word. A brief overview of the water situation and allocation, and then a discussion from questions that you guys might have of staff or the applicant. And also a discussion about whether a second workshop is necessary to discuss topics like the general engineering standards, the airport, and the development agreement. And in terms of a timeline, I think if the desire is to continue with workshops while we're in this election transition, one thing you could consider doing is workshops post-November 7th. You could invite the council-elect to participate in the dialogue as well. I don't think there's any reason you couldn't have them sit at the dais or at the table and have a conversation with you in some format. I think today, look at it as an educational opportunity. I think the mayor alluded to the fact, and all of you know this, it's fairly complex. There's a lot of moving parts. But everybody being at the same point in terms of knowledge at this point, hopefully will give you guys a comfort and the public a comfort that we're reviewing this and doing our due diligence. So at this point, I'll turn it over to George to kind of get into the meat of it.
Thanks, sir. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that hopefully I haven't missed anybody. I see 4 of our planning commissioners here, Mr. Mabarak, Mr. Gardner, Mr. Good, and Mr. Sheets are in attendance, and all have been involved in this process from the very first of the Planning Commission meetings on the topic. As the city manager pointed out, we've sort of listed out an outline. While I have council discussion and questions listed pretty far down the list, obviously if you have questions that are relevant to something that we're talking about, please let me know. We'll try to answer those questions at that time. Some of this is just going to be a little history. A lot of people will already know this. we're going to try and start just to walk through the area that's involved, the existing zoning, what could be done without a master plan, and then talk some about the master plan and the benefits of it, and some further about the modifications and some of the changes that are proposed in this master plan. It was mentioned earlier, I believe, by the mayor in his comments that this is a complex master plan. This is far more complex than any we've had submitted to us previously. Generally, master plans focus themselves on the land uses, the particular areas. It's often to give flexibility to move things back and forth. This plan also contains whole sections of development details that are generally not in a master plan as we see them here. In some other areas of the country, that is common.
Excuse me, George.
Sir?
Is that necessarily bad?
No, but it makes it more complex, and one reason we had so many planning commission meetings to go through this was because of the depth of the complexity, as opposed to a more straightforward plan like we had for Granite Dells Estates, which was almost entirely land uses and locations.
Is that particularly challenging for your department?
It will require some additional effort on both our planning side as well as the development side of the engineering, Public Works Engineering Department, primarily because we sort of have to work with two separate codes by the time you adopt this master plan. If something occurs within here, then we have a different set of books that we look at for verification than we would have if it occurred across the street in an area, say, adjacent to Pinion Oaks or adjacent to the golf course.
Thank you.
Just to start with, the area in question is a relatively large area. It is in a prime location for development. Multiple major roadways come together at this location. The airport is also in an immediate vicinity of the development area. This is not an area we would expect to see sit empty for a long period of time, given those factors, the roadways specifically. The area is inside the city. It was annexed into the city 4 years ago. At the time of that annexation, zoning was applied to the property. That zoning was modified immediately thereafter, almost, in fact, it was at the same meeting.
George, could you
Sir?
please clarify the fact that 2003, 2004, the annexation was contemplated in the general plan, and it was also contemplated again when we did another general plan, I think in 2010. So fact of the matter is this annexation in to the city limits of the city of Prescott has been contemplated for quite a while. It isn't something that's new, and it's not something that's fresh.
You're absolutely correct. This area is important to the city for a number of reasons. Again, the roadway connections and proximity to the airport. Having development occur without city guidance through zoning or through a master plan could potentially have significant adverse effects on the airport's development or significant adverse effects on the community as a whole. It was a desire of the 2003 general plan to see this area annexed in. It was repeated in our latest general plan that the development of this property is important to the city. Land use was reaffirmed with the adoption of that 2015 general plan. The land use that was adopted at that time actually reflects the zoning that is on the property. The two overlie one another, and they are the same effectively. Zoning is the level of development control, and the land use in the general plan is more of a master plan concept. The current zoning on the property includes a mix of single-family, multifamily, and several different commercial designations, a mixed-use designation and general commercial designations, along with a large section that is industrial currently. The industrial designation generally doesn't allow residential uses and was considered a good buffer to the airport. However, it does allow some very impactful manufacturing types of uses that could go there, potentially having an adverse impact on the airport or on roadways, noise production, a number of things like that. It was mentioned during Planning Commission that even if you saw development on this property similar to development at the airport, you could see a structure the size of the Ruger manufacturing building or one of the other larger buildings in the industrial area near the airport. That's all true. This area was intended to allow for industrial to keep the residential a little further away from the runway, but you have a trade-off. The property needs to have some useful development available to it, or it becomes a taking. So the city chose to go with the industrial rather than attempt to force it to become open space, which would effectively require we purchase the property. The intent was to keep residential back a little bit for one primary reason. At that time, the primary reason was to focus on the impacts on the airport of noise complaints. It wasn't because planes crash. Planes crash everywhere. That's not what the focus of the industrial designation was for. Industrial areas would be developed and occupied all day long, potentially 24 hours a day in the case of a production operation like Ruger. People would be there and would still be subject to danger from a plane crash. Our focus was more on protecting the airport from single-family residential that potentially could have occurred there under the county's zoning prior to our annexation. So again, when we annexed it in, we were looking to push the residential back a little further away from the end of the runway, and specifically to push single-family residential, which by far and away creates more noise complaints than any other type of residential use in vicinities of airports. That effectively was done with the industrial zoning.
So if by implication you're inferring that under county zoning, the property could have been developed and the city would have had no input whatsoever with regards to what was being done out there next to our airport.
We would have had very little, if any. That's correct.
Thank you.
So another large portion of the property is designated business regional. It's a commercial designation. Again, the intention was to provide for commercial uses along those major roadways and at those major intersections, 89 at Pioneer Parkway and 89A, and Willow Creek at Pioneer Parkway. That has since changed somewhat because Willow Creek was realigned and now there is another area to the north. We weren't anticipating the roundabout at the time that the annexation occurred at Ruger Road, but it was an intersection planned for that area even as far back as the original annexation of the property. So those commercial areas do a couple of things. They provide an opportunity for retail commercial uses which bring a lot of tax dollars into the city. They also provide for potential job creation and jobs in the areas around the retail sales businesses. The other two areas of the property that constitute a lot of the acreage are single-family zoning area. Single-family 18 is actually the same zoning as Pinion Oaks. A lot of residential property. It is far from infrastructure. It is not likely to be one of the early areas to develop on this property because you need roads, water, and sewer infrastructure nearby in order to extend them out. The cost of doing a major project out there in one fell swoop is almost out of the question. Development would occur in stages. The zoning anticipated those stages. So we looked at how it would occur. Commercial first, the roundabout and the intersection where the roundabout is first, and then a future extension out into the single family. It's a little bit different than you often see where residential is the primary development on the property. In this case, residential would not be the primary the development. Some form of commercial, industrial, recreation, things like that would be the primary development. The development pattern in the zoning was created and done at the time of the annexation to be compatible with nearby properties. That was an important part of the entire process. Nothing up there is significantly different than something else that's nearby.
George, remind us again, what year was this annexed?
13 for the primary development and 15 for a piece across the street north of the airport.
Thank you.
George, it might be valuable to go back to the last slide just because, you know, we speak in city government terms, breaking down these.
Certainly.
Just explaining exactly what, you know, is an MU, is that mixed use, is that?
So we'll start with the IL. It's industrial light. The vast majority of the city's industrial property is designated industrial light. All of the industrial development at the airport and near the airport is industrial light development. The BR is business regional. It's our heavier general commercial uses. We have a business general, which allows just lighter, more retail and office uses. So business regional will allow office uses, medical complexes, any kind of commercial retail centers. It would allow auto dealerships. It would allow a heavier mix of uses and more combination of uses than some of our other commercial designations. You'll notice that all of the red areas shown on the map up here are the same color. All of those are business regional. They all allow that same heavier mix of uses. The sort of gold-colored areas are designated MF-H. That's multifamily. It allows for multiple residential units in single buildings, apartment buildings, condominium-type buildings. It also would allow for single-family homes. Our zoning is a hierarchy with higher intensity uses like business regional, allowing all other uses that are permitted in the other districts within that. So a business regional area would allow for multifamily or single family. Industrial is the only exemption of that. There's no allowance for residential development within the industrial. Light yellow, the SF-18 at the top. SF is single family. It allows single family lots, 18,000 square foot minimum lot size. There are processes to reduce those lot sizes by creating planned area developments with open space as part of them. The idea is that instead of having large yards, you have smaller lots with houses on them, and some of those privately owned yards become commonly owned open space. That's been a very popular process up here recently. Most of our subdivisions that we've seen over the last 5 years have been planned area developments. The MU, as the city manager pointed out, MU stands for mixed use. It allows residential at smaller scale, not a full apartment complex, but something smaller than that. It allows most commercial type office and some retail uses. It's a light commercial designation intended to be compatible with residential around it. So think of corner coffee shop, something small scale in the form of a boutique food store of some kind, or restaurants. Those are commonly used within that MU district.
Oh, no, one more question, sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
On this map, on the lower right corner, those red areas, are they currently used as commercial property?
No. In fact, none of that has been developed as commercial property at this time. It's vacant, open at this point. The designation is still there for commercial development, but none has occurred.
Okay.
Which parcel covers Antelope Crossing? Is that part of the 1,800?
That's
acres?
correct. The business regional area to the north, the red area to the north, at the Ruger Roundabout contains parts of that Antelope Crossing. It's there and down along the new alignment of Willow Creek Road. Antelope Crossings is a single-family designated subdivision, a planned area development. It is permitted by right within the business regional zoning that exists there. So one of the questions that always comes up, or had come up a number of times during the Planning Commission reviews, was just how much density could go in the properties under their current zoning. How many units ultimately could develop? That's not an easy question to answer. Again, because we have a hierarchy of zoning designations, in theory, all of the commercial property could develop with residential uses. That almost never happens, but in theory, it could. So coming up with an ultimate number is a bit arbitrary. If you built out everything that you could build residential, the number we're getting is roughly the 14,000 number. And that assumes a combination of single and multifamily in the commercial zoning districts, multifamily in the multifamily zoning district, and single family in the single family zoning district. Again, if you really maxed everything out that would allow multifamily, perhaps that number is a little bit higher. with normal development patterns, that number will be somewhat less, probably below the 10,500 number that we've heard from the deep well planners. That again depends on the pattern of development. The flexibility is there to allow either a lot of multifamily or a lot of single family or a true mix, which is what the zoning intended and what the master plan is proposing. And that mix would bring the numbers down because you're going to take acreages away from residential development every time you build something that's commercial. So one of the things that came up and discussed was,
George, when you bring that up, because the general plans, I keep going back to the general plans.
yes, sir.
Because that's something that the community as a whole bought into, not only once, but several times. What was the contemplated population in the last general plan, if not the general plan before? Build out.
For
What was contemplated that the city would grow to in those general plans?
the city, it's the whole city.
City, that's right.
Those numbers have, again, varied a little bit because development patterns are hard to predict. The last number that we called out was in the upper 60,000 number. Part of the problem with that number is that doesn't take into account how much water may be available to feed development, and it doesn't take into account the long-term development. Nothing happens quick. Nothing develops quick. One of the things that the city General Plan Committee looked at, a committee appointed by this body, looked at was what long-term ultimate development occurs, not with a time frame attached to it. So it could be 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. What's the maximum area we can build to? And that's where they came up with the estimate. And again, it's a rough estimate. Wild guess carried out to 2 decimal places.
Okay, George, I think it's really important when we have these conversations to keep the whole thing up in front of the public all the time. Okay? The same thing with the contemplation on the water. Same thing with the fact of the matter is the amount of water we have for delivery will ultimately control what takes place over the next 20, 30, 40 years. All right?
Absolutely.
And that's one of those things we sort of lose focus on when we talk about things. So, the water, in what water we legally have authority to distribute, will control certain things, and one of them has to do with the population.
Very true. Water is going to be a part of this presentation. We've saved it till a little bit further along because it's something that has been discussed quite a bit by council. There's some very good information there about potential development patterns and maximums for this particular area, not the city as a whole, but this particular area. One of the main things that was discussed during our planning commission meetings, both by our planning commissioners as well as by the public and discussed among staff, were the changes that were proposed to various city codes, rules, regulations as part of this master plan. The planners who developed the proposed plan for the Deepwell Ranch want to create something that's got very specific controls in place for development. Some of those things are often handled in covenants and restrictions or through a homeowners association, some of those types of things. Others are design standards that are different than our current design standards. The city's adopted land development code. This is our zoning code. And general engineering standards. This is our engineering code, design requirements through all of those. Those have been set pretty much here for developments that have occurred previously. The planners were looking for different types of standards in the master plan. They were asking for modifications or changes to the city's requirements through a number of different sections or different categories. In fact, pretty much all of our categories had some modification or deviation initially proposed.
Excuse me, George.
Sir.
Were they asking to lower the standards?
They're not necessarily lower, they're different. It's not necessarily bad. The standards they proposed in the master plan exist in other places. So other developments have occurred through those same controls. They're just different than we're used to dealing with here.
Other places, meaning in this area, or other places?
Other places in the
Other
country
place in
or in
Arizona.
the state. Some developments, large community developments down in the Phoenix area. Some large municipalities, some communities back east use development standards that are more similar to what were proposed there than what we use.
So those are just standards. It doesn't have to look like other areas, but the standards are,
No, one of the things that we went back and forth quite a bit and worked with them at a staff level on was something as simple as how wide are lanes on a street? Are lanes 12 feet wide? Are they 10 feet wide? Are they 14 feet wide? They vary across the country. We have a standard that we've adopted. The standard they were requesting for this development was different than that. So a lot of negotiation occurred to reach an agreement on what was acceptable to us. And again, some of what we do as city staff is to over-regulate to protect. Sometimes we put requirements into our codes that are potentially more than we need. Well, just from a zoning standpoint, I can tell you that planners always overpark. They always have a higher parking requirement for retail commercial, except for restaurants. And we always underpark them. It's just the standard that's been developed across the country. So we're open to negotiations on those types of things because we realize that in some cases, it's an arbitrary decision. We have to pick a number. How wide is a lane? You can't have them vary back and forth as you're driving down the street, not if you want to have a safe roadway. So we pick a standard.
so just varying from standards that we have right now is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it adds complexity. And again, one of the reasons I brought it up in the first place was that that's why it took so long to get through the Planning Commission. They spent a lot of time thinking about that. That's also why, as the city manager pointed out, or the mayor pointed out, earlier, staff has spent a huge amount of time reviewing this, staff throughout the city, planning staff, engineering staff, the airport, all of us have been involved at some stage. Because there are so many of these standards that they're deviating slightly from. And none of them are huge. There are just a lot of them to deal with. So it's not necessarily bad, it's just complex.
Thank you.
So George, in section 4, page 2, 4-2, it says the general development standards including in this master plan fully amend any city rules, regulations, policies.
So some of that has been negotiated away. So they're not fully amending everything. Some of the requirements are being amended or proposed to be amended. If council adopts this plan and adopts the development agreement with the modifications that will be attached to the development agreement, then you are in fact modifying our current city standards for this development and this development only.
For the better?
Some could be better, yes. Others, we sort of like the ways we have it. I'm used to traditional zoning. I like traditional zoning. We have a lot of flexibility in our zoning. What they're proposing for zoning isn't better or worse than ours. What they're proposing for street design isn't better or worse than ours. It's different, and it's to a particular vision that they have of the development occurring.
I kept reading flexibility through this.
So flexibility is something that everyone wants when you're looking at your own side, and no one wants when it's your neighbor next door. One of the things that they're looking for is the flexibility to move things around and to have different types of uses within their project. And I've got a slide or two where I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes here to give you an idea of the type of thing that they're talking about with flexibility.
I've got a question. Are you done? Yeah. Maybe it would be helpful, maybe for me more than anybody else, I don't know, to talk about the master plan and then the subsequent development agreement. And as I understand, if we approve the master plan with these variations, I won't say deviations, but variations, are they then codified for the future and they cannot be changed? And they, I'm having a little trouble with, the master plan and what that entails as far as, tying our hands, and then also development agreement, and, what does that do? Where do we have the flexibility to step in if we start seeing that there's issues?
So there are provisions in both the master plan and in the development agreement to allow for either party to propose a modification. We do not have any master plans in the city that are older than 2 years old that have not been amended. This master plan will be back in front of you to be amended. That is an extremely common process. Prescott Lakes has amended its master plan, I want to say 6 times. That's not an unusual circumstance at all. There is some locking down of current standards through the development agreement and some in the master plan as well. One of the things that private property owners, especially a developer, wants is certainty of standards. It allows them to plan ahead, it allows them to market their property, it allows them to react quickly when the market changes on their property if they already know what those standards are and the standards aren't constantly changing. Now, we don't constantly change our city codes, but we do change our city codes. And when that happens, it can sometimes be different for a developer, provide different incentives or provide different restrictions on a developer than he had prior to us changing the codes. So one of the things that they're looking for in this particular case is to lock down the codes, so to speak, as they are today. Now, that doesn't apply to life safety matters. It doesn't apply to the building code, for instance. We constantly upgrade the building code. We're not going to negotiate with them about whether the latest building code is applicable or not. It will always be applicable. But certain things, like what are the setbacks, what are the processes for creating a subdivision plat, those can be locked down to current processes and current standards and would stay that way. That, again, adds a little to the complexity. That's one of the reasons why I keep using that word. That means that we have to keep track of 2 sets of books, so to speak, one for them, one for the rest of Prescott. When we adopt a code and change processes that cover the rest of Prescott, it won't affect these guys. So we have to go back and look at a different set of books for them when we're reviewing things. We're perfectly capable of doing that. We do it to a minor degree when we approve planned area development types of subdivision plats, because they often deviate from setbacks or lot sizes. They're not standard straight out of the zoning code, they're slightly different. So your staff can handle that. It's just some additional work that will be necessary to keep track of those. One of the bigger concerns that was expressed by the Planning Commission and some public at the time was the creation of 2 different sets of citizens in Prescott. Inside the subdivision, inside the master plan, you have a different set of rules than outside, even if you're just across the street. Pinion Oaks is directly across the street. The communities along the golf course are just across the street. Those communities are going to have different sets of rules than the master plan area. That is what master plans do.
But within that master plan, there are subsections to that master plan that are always eligible for change. That's not creating a different class of people.
Not a different class of people, a different class of rules.
Well, within that subdivision section, and taking Prescott Lakes as a prime example, they changed their master plan numerous times.
They have.
Based upon the selling market. But also there's a responsibility you have to the people within that master plan not to change the zoning to adversely affect their way of life.
Correct.
But each one of those subsections of that master plan have got to go back to the Planning Commission for review, as well as the City Council.
For amendments to the master plan. And the same thing would apply with this situation. Amendments to the master plan are effectively a rezoning. So a significant change to the master plan would require a review by Planning Commission and back to the City Council for a modification.
Well, that's my point. The point is we'd be chastised if we weren't doing a long-range plan. That's the right thing to do. But to change that master plan is the right thing to do, to take it back through a public process. And I think that's what people want to be assured of, that this master plan is not set in stone, and when there is change, there's full elevation to the public, Planning Commission, the City Council, that those changes are being made.
That's absolutely correct.
And I guess I'd just like to comment, so like, because I live in Prescott Lakes, Cliff Rose is just across the way, and we can see each other's houses. That doesn't create, as Steve was saying, I mean, they're just different
Just
rules
different
to
sets of
apply
rules.
because we live in different neighborhoods that had different standards at the time, because I'm in a homeowner association. So, I mean, that happens all over the city now.
It does,
Right.
just to a little bit lesser degree than this case. Again, it's just a lot of changes compared to most of our master plans. It's not good and it's not bad. It's just different.
Just different, okay.
Well, let me ask you one here on the, let's say, take lighting. Looks like they're asking for a variation on lighting. So I guess that's basically like street lights, things of that nature, or lighting.
Types of lighting or the locations of lights, yes. Again, not a big deal necessarily. Obviously, the area where this development would occur is sensitive to light. We wouldn't want to allow searchlights or unscreened ball field lights at the end of a runway. There are certain things that we've negotiated back into the master plan to cover those types of things. So again, it's different. It's not necessarily bad.
George, of this list, how many of these have staff and the developer agreed in principle?
In principle, almost all of them. There are some things left out that are still underway. The engineering staff is still sending comments back and forth with the planners on some things that are associated with the development agreement and some that are associated with the master plan. That's an ongoing process. It's still working its way through. We would anticipate that we should be able to reach some common ground where the city doesn't give on some things and the planners don't give on some things. I would expect that will happen.
We're forever
given some
evolving,
time.
George. I give you another example is the monument mailboxes all over Prescott Lakes. Well, our engineering department now is not allowing that anymore because they became a hazard, a public safety nuisance, so to speak. Well, when we first started putting in the monument mailboxes, everybody thought it looked beautiful, but that's not the case now. Now we're creating mail areas that are safe, like at Granite Dells, where everybody has a mailbox in a common area. So as those things evolve, they probably evolve for a reason. And usually those reasons are pretty specific.
They generally do, and those are the types of changes that would allow for some modification that might be at a staff level of the master plan and some of the requirements. There are triggers before it becomes a major amendment that comes back to council. Some of those smaller things, like the type of mailbox you're allowed, is not something we're going to bring back to the city council. That will be worked out at a staff level. That's something that the master plan and the development agreement would set for you. You would know where those triggers are through both of those documents.
George, I think one of the key issues is who is going to make the decision on the changes in the master plan. And in what they propose, there's a person called a plan administrator who seems to have a great deal of discretion, according to their plan, to make these changes without public input, without public hearings. Has that been negotiated? Is it different than what we've been presented with our agenda packet?
There is proposed to be this sort of czar who would be the common focus of all of their actions. That there is a benefit to the city of having that situation. We on the city staff side generally have a czar, our city manager, who is the apex of the. He's budgeting for a larger chair. One of the things that allows for is that the lower level staff on the city side would work through the city manager to negotiate with the plan administrator on their side, who would work through their lower level, either associations, neighborhood associations, or project managers, to make sure that everything is in compliance with the master plan. It keeps you from having 20 people on their side talking to 30 people on our side and no one having the whole picture. So we actually support the concept of that. The triggers for where it becomes a public amendment is key to that. Small changes, changes that don't necessarily affect multiple neighborhoods or those that don't affect neighborhoods outside of the master plan area, potentially those remain as a staff level. They're handled through the city manager and the plan administrator. Those things that affect outside properties or affect multiple properties within the master planned area probably should be a major amendment to the master plan. And I believe we're working towards that through the development agreement process as to what those triggers are.
It should be more specific, so there's a clear line between what's handled by a plan administrator and what requires city staff overview and council approval and transparency.
So if there's a modification to something within the master plan, it does require concurrence on the city side. In some cases, we don't have a lot of flexibility on the concurrence. It's a yes, no. In other cases, the city has a lot of input into the design. We've had extensive conversations with them about landscaping, for instance. You know, we're very focused on water-saving landscaping. Those types of things that, you know, that we don't generally see up here are huge lawns or lots of playing fields with grass. Those things would be something that would require a negotiation process. It wouldn't be just the administrator saying it's okay to do that. It would require the city staff level at least to approve of something similar.
Well, getting back to my lighting example, again, you know, as a pilot, I agree with you. I wouldn't want to have any kind of stadium lights off the end of the runway when I'm trying to take off or land. And the other thing I would hope we would not do is eliminate dark skies, because I think that's important to a lot of people in Prescott. And so I guess what I'm saying is when I see things like lighting, I'm just a little concerned where we're going, and, you know,
Again,
I don't know how we get that exposure to the public so that they're comfortable.
so there are versions of the existing master plan available to the public. There's a link on the city's website that takes you to Espiritu Loci's website. They're up-to-date versions. That's the same version you have that's on there. The public can look at it and see what those criteria are. In most cases, for instance, lighting, we've really negotiated that down to being approximate what the city requires. There are a few minor deviations here and there, and it's not a big deal. The issue of spotlights and unshielded lights, those things, we said that's not acceptable. They said we understand. Staff came to an agreement with them. That's occurred throughout all of this list. This list is to just tell you how many different sections of the plan were modified. It doesn't mean that we're at odds over all of them. In fact, we aren't at odds over many of them.
So back to the mayor's point about the lighting, will this affect our dark skies?
Effectively, they comply with our requirements, yes.
So it's okay with dark skies? Okay, thank
You
you.
know, I think eventually we're going to have to understand that they're very reactive to the market. And if the market says, we want dark skies, then they're going to make sure there are dark skies. It certainly seems like the folks that move up here want to be closer to nature. They want dark skies. They want certain things that it's not a build it and they will come situation. It's you better build our way and we'll come. And so I think that we need to also consider the market and who would actually move here.
And bringing that up is a good segue to another piece of this, and that is one of the major benefits for master planning is to allow for that flexibility to be there, that you're not locking development out of a particular property because it has the wrong zoning. That's one of the things that we don't want to do. I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly because we've actually covered a lot of this. We've negotiated things with them. We've talked about the changes. We've accepted some. We've argued with them over others. Some are being proposed to be in the development agreement. Some are proposed to be left in the master plan.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I
You
wore
you
comfortable
mentioned that you
shoes.
changed the development standards wording. Do you have that wording?
It's extensive. The last version of that I saw had 96 proposed modifications from our engineering. That's been submitted to the planners. They're working back and forth on it. In fact, I think they've scheduled a telephone conference for later in the week to continue going through those things.
Thank you.
George, I don't know where it's going to come up, but as long as it's on my mind, it'll come up right now. But
I'm flexible.
Prescott Lakes, as a master plan, had all its commercial properties Every single one of them had a sheet flow done on it as far as drainage and how much square footage could be built on a certain property, how much that sheet flow was going to be, and that's how you build your infrastructure to handle the water.
Right, they're called master reports. There's a master drainage report, a master sewer report, a master.
And getting to the point where we've fallen way down, in my opinion, as a city, is lot-to-lot drainage. And what we like to do is point at the other guy and say, it's not my fault, that's your fault. And then it becomes a civil lawsuit, and the city doesn't want to touch it. Matter of fact, they run from it. So as we're designing this thing, I would only hope that the lot-to-lot drainage is a huge concept in its overall drainage plan, because we don't need to have that happen again with people out there that are trying to build a nice home, and then all of a sudden the home above them is designed and nobody took into consideration where that water was going to go, and all of a sudden you're washing the next guy out. So I'd hope that would be somewhere in that plan to make sure that we don't have civil lawsuits and that we're doing the right thing for the public.
And I saw both of the deep well planners making notes as you talked, so I think they will take that in consideration. So the master plan does something different. I'm planning and zoning, so I have to talk about zoning. They don't use traditional zoning. Their intent is not to have the geometric, planning commission, I use the term squares, but they're never square, designations of a particular zoning on a particular spot. You remember our zoning map showed those particular spots. What they're proposing are called land use groups. And I've seen this done elsewhere. It's not common, but it has been done elsewhere. The land use groups are, in fact, layers of land uses that cover the property or portions of the property. When a developer comes into a particular piece of property, what they're looking for is a determination of what am I going to build and what are the standards that are tied to each of those designations. So if they're looking at a piece of property and it has 3 layers over it, 3 land use groups that apply to that particular property, and they say, I want to build commercial on this property, there's a set of standards and a set of requirements that go with commercial development that would apply to their development. They may be, and probably would be, different than if they picked a residential use for that same piece of property. These layers of different designations allow flexibility, but also have controls attached to them. What it does is effectively create a lot of mixed-use designations if you're trying to translate from traditional zoning to what they're proposing. Everything's a mixed use because you can pick any of those particular categories and you have specific limitations that are tied to that category. It's a lot of flexibility for development. The controls that are attached, the standards that are attached to each of those designations create a compatibility, or should create a compatibility buffer between uses of different categories. So you could have 2 pieces of property. One picks commercial, and the one next door says, I'm going to build a civic use. They have different requirements to provide for buffers, separations, compatibility between the two, so that if you build them both, in theory, they should be compatible. It's different than traditional zoning. Traditional zoning says separate uses. Separate uses to avoid incompatible uses being in close proximity. You don't want a slaughterhouse next door to the neighborhood. You don't want a manufacturing plant next door to a neighborhood. Those types of things are separated by traditional zoning. That's what zoning was initially created for. It was to keep those types of uses that caused life safety and health issues away from one another. This doesn't do that. This does it in a different way. It provides additional buffers or additional requirements between uses depending on which layer you pick. And again, if you look at their master plan, they have a whole series of land use groups that are defined and shown in a geographic area. The first thing you notice is that certain of those geographic areas cover all of the property, and others cover a smaller and smaller area, depending on the type of use. The very core urban development that they're proposing is limited to a very small area on the property. Single-family residential is allowed almost anywhere on the property. There are a couple of exceptions for that. Basically, those areas that are protected around the end of the airport runway. So it's a different approach to zoning than most of us are used to. Most of us are used to the purpose of separating incompatible uses.
Within the master plan, George, if I may, what's to prevent at a later date, while we chose to use up a majority of the density in one area, then going backwards and saying, okay, now we want to go backwards. We want to change something.
There isn't anything really. It's designed to allow that. It's designed to allow for the first blush development to occur over, say, the next 15 years, but commercial in one area, residential nearby. 20 years from now, the market says, do something different. The buildings have gotten older, the users are gone for whatever reason, and you want to do something different on the property. You go back to your land use groups and you can determine different uses that are allowed there. A retailer coming in saying, I want that corner, and that corner's traditionally been an apartment complex, but it allows for commercial use. One of the land use layers covers it. You could say, I want that corner, I want to build it commercial, what are my standards for commercial development? They will pull out of their master plan the standards for commercial development for that property, and they can proceed. There's no rezoning required, there's no public review process required, except for potentially a site plan review or a subdivision plat, depending on the type of use. So those two types of things would come back to the city to look at. So the benefit of this is it's a one-time zoning of the property. You don't have this constant rezoning process, which takes anywhere from 2 to 4 months, depending on the size of the property and the complexity, because that can inhibit a quick determination based on market pressures. The master plan allows all of this to occur because you've already established all of those requirements in these layers, these land use groups, ahead of time.
I don't fully comprehend what you're saying, George. To be very candid with you, I keep going back to a couple of things, and you haven't quite gotten there yet, so I'm going to wait until you talk a little bit about water. Okay, because to my limited thought process, we have X amount of water available to distribute. And that X amount of water is limited to about 33, 34, 3,500 units. That's what it is.
Well, it's a little bit more than that, and we'll get into that, Mayor Pro Tem, but you're right. The ultimate growth management tool is water.
Okay, and that's
It's a fair
that's
statement.
where I'm coming from. At the end of the day, you know, when you talk about long-range planning, you got to be talking about long-range planning on all of it. And if
Including the water.
If at the beginning stages, we're looking at long-range planning, and we're talking about a specific amount of land mass, are we long-range planning for that land mass contemplated on a specific amount of permissible density or whatever the case is, units, you know, we come up with these different terms about every 20 minutes. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, 6, 8, 10 years from now, what is the expectation that the community has that instead of there being limitation based on this, that being the 3,300 units or 3,500 units or whatever the case would be, 4,000 units. Now all of a sudden we're looking at something different. In this particular case, we're negotiating, or we're in a negotiating stage as to what the level of build out for this specific 1,800 acres is going to be.
That's
not
correct.
18,000, 1,800. That's what we're talking about. And that's where some of this comes into play. You know, when we talk about long-range planning, I think the community has a right to talk about long-range planning. Okay?
We agree and we understand. The next part of this, so I was only halfway through. The next part of this is they provided a land use budget that is part of the master plan, which sets out the maximum amount of uses, either by density, by the number of dwelling units, or by square footages for commercial. That's a common way to measure commercial uses, floor area. By acreage for open space. So there's a land use budget that's also in play. So while you have the right to switch from residential to commercial, for instance, on a particular piece of property, you still need to be able to exchange the residential in the budget for the commercial in the budget. You still have to be able to work within the land use budget that's also part of the master plan. So that's sort of a secondary control over the development on property. It's possible that you build 2,900,000 square feet of commercial development out there, and someone wants to convert residential to commercial, and the budget has been expended for commercial area. That would require a master plan amendment. That would be a major master plan amendment. We'll be back here to change that. That's not likely to happen because of the large numbers involved in their land use budget. Will allow for some flexibility. For instance, the land use budget says that you can have, well, that 2,900,000 square feet of commercial use. Well, if you have a commercial building and you remove the commercial building to build residential, you take the area of that commercial building and you put it back in the budget because you're not using it anymore. And then you look at the residential to see if residential is available for the same number of dwelling units that you're looking for. It is very similar to our budget amendment process. It's not the initial budget, but every year we move monies around to cover things. We spend some out of public works that we really meant to spend out of the airport, and we shift money back and forth. The same thing occurs with the square footages for commercial and with the acreages and the dwelling units for residential. It's another layer of control that sort of limits, so you can't just have everything turn into residential or everything turn into commercial.
Here again, and I realize we haven't gotten to a point yet, George, of discussing water. And I know we will get there. There's nothing to prohibit a private property owner from procuring water other than from the city.
That's correct. State law has
when we-
provisions to allow certain,
So then when we're talking about land use and procuring the opportunity to talk about residential units, or we're talking about commercial units, et cetera, that's not limited solely by the city's ability to provide water.
that's correct. We
All
understand.
right,
Yes, sir.
transparency to the public, they have a right to know that while at this time frame in history, we only have the water available for maybe this many units, that doesn't necessarily govern, that's all it will ever be.
That's correct. I think you had a presentation a month or so ago from someone who may be seeking an annexation who told you he's acquired private water rights and would be willing to exchange those with the city in order to annex. That's a possibility.
George, on the land use budget.
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am.
I know you were opening your mouth to say something, but there's no minimum amount of land or square footage committed to commercial. And commercial development in this area is really critical for a number of reasons. Not just the sales tax generation, but traffic circulation. As this area grows, there'll be more people, more customers who need places to buy food and clothes and goods and so forth. We don't want to be sending them down one of two roads to get into the shopping areas of Prescott. And we really don't want to encourage them to go to Prescott Valley along 89A. So having a commercial center here is, to me, it's critical to the survival of this whole, the growth of this whole area. I would like to see a minimum commitment for commercial in the development agreement or in their land use budget.
You know,
And I
George,
see the planners taking notes.
when we were first presented, and I wasn't on council at the time, Prescott Lakes, I believe on Prescott Lakes Parkway, there was going to be a commercial area with a grocery store and shopping and things like that.
Hotel resort, yes.
Okay, and what happened to that?
The market didn't bring anything for that area. They brought different uses for that area. There are a couple of apartment complexes and retirement centers instead. There is still commercial area available.
So how can we mandate a minimum commercial space if the market doesn't want it?
If you reserved a particular minimum number, then that minimum number would just sit in the budget until such time as the market demanded it.
Question. I know.
More of a philosophical question and not a technical one.
Getting into that, as people that want to invest money, they look at rooftops. And if the rooftops aren't there, commercial's not there. So the plan has got to be well-designed and got to be well on its way before you can dictate a commercial zone that actually means something. Out Willow Creek Road, where the Fry's Shopping Center is, back in the day when Jim Williams developed that land sat there fallow, the old farmland, while the residential built up around it on the backside. And then came the shops, and then came commerce. So there's two different ways to look at that. But in this overall master plan, I would like to see, and everybody's got their own opinion certainly, is the fact that it's a big piece of land, a gentleman owns it, but there's opportunities that we need to make sure that we've had conversation about a substation, police station, fire station. It's not always about parks and trails. It's about public safety. Maybe there's a place out there for a cemetery. All the house cemeteries are full. When you start talking about long-range planning, think from birth to death. And this is one of these areas where 50 years from now, I'll be gone, 100 years comes into this, and the James family has evolved 2 or 3 more times. Have we covered everything that should be covered in that master plan? And I can only hope that those things are being checked on.
So one of the things that I'm sorry, sir.
It's okay, George. I'd like to add on what Steve brought in, and I'd like to move away from a substation and fire stations. I mean, that's a one-time cost and some maintenance. The big cost there is to man those stations, to put public safety in those stations. And as we geographically get bigger, and neither chief is here, but our count of public safety hasn't risen that much. Is there some way legally, John, that, and I'm not designing your development, Mr. James, but I imagine there's going to be some sort of planned community where there are maybe homeowner association fees. Could there be, in that fee, go to public safety?
In theory, by way of a development agreement, the city could, if obviously if the developer agrees, the city could make some sort of financial arrangement where the development, whatever that is, pays the operational costs for whether it's the maintenance of the parks, whether it's, some part of the operational cost of public safety. It has to, you'd have to sort of allocate it out for this project because, if you put in a fire station / police substation, that wouldn't be limited to serving this 1,800 acres. Would obviously be, the service area would be broader. So there, if the developer or the development is willing to, provide some sort of financial, or, finance stream or money stream to cover the operational cost, you could do that. You can't do it with, a CFD. You can't do it with development impact fees, special improvement districts, those types of things. It would have to be basically some sort of business deal, that to cover those personnel and, PSPRS type costs.
I have, maybe it's clarification for me only, but so originally, when this was annexed, there was 14,000 plus possible residential units. I guess that was basically multifamily, single family, that type of thing.
That's correct.
Maybe some commercial. So what we're doing now is they're asking for a rezoning to this land use group,
Special
which gives them a
plan
hierarchy of options for what they could actually put on that piece of property. Is that what I'm?
That's exactly correct. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Mayor,
So
you
basically, what we're doing is going from the previous annexation agreement for the types of zoning to this new land use group. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you succinctly nailed really what the debate is about, is the existing zoning what you want, or do you want to go under this master plan? I mean, at the end of the day, there are a lot of complexities to this, but that's the call. That's the decision.
If I could just contribute one thing, Councilwoman Wilcox mentioned and a couple others about setting aside a certain amount of property for commercial. Obviously, you can set that aside in in traditional zoning, you can deem something like it is now, business regional. And in most cities, zoning is exclusive. You do what's allowed in the zoning and nothing else. Ours is inclusive zoning. So even under the current zoning, there's no set aside mandated for commercial. So it would the only way to do that would have to be done by way of, the development agreement or the master plan, if the developer were to agree to that. But at the same time, at most, you could make them build the building, but you can't force them to get a tenant or buyer to occupy the building. So that becomes kind of the challenge in those types of set-asides is, unless the market's there for that type of commercial use, it's a tough sort of row to hoe, and it seems like sort of market-wise, it's going the other way, where commercial buildings are converting to residential type use, or old industrial is converting to lofts and things. So, because of the sort of e-commerce, so it's one of those things. It's doable, but there are a number of challenges in getting, getting that agreed to is one thing. Getting it actually built and occupied is another challenge, just so you're kind of aware of that.
Mayor, I remember in one of the PNC meetings, Commissioner Maverick mentioned that, you can't make retail come. So you can set aside that land, but it could be there and be empty for a long time. The other is, Commissioner George Sheets had a table. He had a sheet that compared the difference between the traditional zoning and the master plan. And I think I asked for that to be,
It was included in the agenda packet for you?
it's in this one that we got?
Yes. So that was not in the master plan,
okay.
in the staff report, in the attachments to the staff report.
Okay, all right.
That actually did something similar to what we showed earlier, where we listed off the different types of uses and which ones are being modified. The benefits of a master plan are very strong.
Right.
I
think that's
I'm a
what I
planner.
wanted to show. That's fine. I think that would be good for the public to see.
It's very important to look at master plan developments over traditional zoning, because traditional zoning is a one snapshot in time, and it locks down property and does not allow for flexibility that's necessary for the development market as it occurs. So master plans allow you more flexibility. It's not bad. When we say flexibility, that's good, not bad. It allows for quicker reactions to circumstances to allow development to occur. We understand that vacant properties are very often perceived as forever vacant properties, and they generally are never that situation. Someone owns them, and someone owns them for a reason. Much of the area surrounding Prescott belongs to the State Land Department. The whole purpose of the State Land Department is to sell that property for profit. That's the purpose of it. The State Land Department's a developer. So we see a lot of those types of things come up, and that's one of the reasons why we like master plans. It's a
Would it
further
be
look
possible
forward.
Would it be possible to put that up? So,
We can round that up, yes. So it was part of the.
well, maybe
staff
not now, but at some point in time.
We'll
I
have it
think
for
it's
you
important.
sometime a little bit later. And I realize what time it is, so I'm going to sort of speed up just a little bit. Please stop me or slow me down if you need something particular. We want to be able to get to water.
George, you said that, and I now get a question, and I apologize. Under the existing zoning, was there any negotiated set-aside for civic uses or, i.e. public safety facilities or the like?
Nothing specific, no, sir. Traditionally, zoning doesn't do that. That's something that would occur at a subdivision plat level or at a commercial properties site plan approval level. So none of that was done, no, sir. This slide just shows you the similarities. The city's land development code has a whole list of uses and a whole list of different districts, and uses are allowed or not allowed. The Deepwell Master Plan has the same or a very similar approach. They use a land use table. You can go through it and see what's allowed or not allowed depending on that particular use. So a good portion of the discussion was intended to cover some of the things that the Planning Commission went through, but I'm going to, again, move a little fast through that unless you have specific questions. One of the important things that I think you need to know is the Planning Commission held 7 meetings, some of them lasting 3.5 hours. They spent a lot of time, gave the public a lot of opportunity to have input in the process. From my perspective, again, the personal comment from me, your planning commission did an excellent job in reviewing this. They did what they needed to do. They spent the time they needed to spend, and they allowed the public the input that the public deserves. One of the
I think
things
what you're
they
saying is,
decided,
I think what you're saying then is that the P&Z only looks at land use.
they
and zoning,
predominantly
right?
look at land uses, and one of the things that they found, again, using the word complexity, I apologize, because so much is addressed in the master plan, much of it was outside the normal, outside their charter in your appointment. Their charter is to look at land uses, the most appropriate land uses, and the impacts of those land uses on other developments nearby. It isn't to look at whether or not the street should be 14 feet wide or the parking spaces should be 17 feet long. There's a lot of that detail in the plan that they set aside for either staff to review and work out with the deep well planners, or for the city council to make decisions on later.
So that's those 21 considerations.
That's part of their 21. There's also whole sections of the plan that were pulled out and attached to the development agreement for a discussion with council.
So you're telling me then that it was outside their scope, but they had concerns and they forwarded those concerns to the
That's
to the
correct.
council.
Or they felt that it was outside their scope and it wasn't appropriate for them to decide whether a process that normally involves city council should be amended or not. It should be city council that decides that.
Okay, thanks.
They ultimately voted in favor of the master plan. The vote was 4-3, but they also included 21 conditions to that recommendation of approval. Some of the 21 conditions were the result of multiple meetings of the Planning Commission, and during the process of those multiple meetings, modifications and amendments have been made to the master plan that address some of that. So there are not 21 outstanding things that need to be modified. There are parts of 21 outstanding things that need to be modified to comply strictly with their recommendation. Again, Planning Commission recommends to this body. The city council can choose to accept all 21, they can modify them, you can throw all 21 out. Obviously, it was significant enough for the Planning Commission to put them together in a list for you to consider. So I'm going to step through them, again, relatively quickly. If you have particular topics that you would like me to stop on, please say so. Probably the most impactful of all of the conditions was the first one, and that was to, they recommended to the city council to negotiate a reduction of 50% of the number of dwelling units in the overall density of the development. That original density that was proposed and is shown in the master plan, still in the version of the master plan you have, says a maximum of 10,500 dwelling units. And that's a maximum. It doesn't say they have water for that. It doesn't say that they have a developer already lined up for that. It says that's their maximum. And that's the maximum number that's in their land use budget. Remember, we talked about a budget a little while ago. Dwelling units for residential is in the land use budget at 10,500. The Planning Commission felt that number was too high for a number of reasons. It's really hard to bring them down into a quick synopsis. It involves the development patterns of the city, the existing conditions on the property, nearby properties and what those properties look like or will develop as. So they felt it was important enough to move it to number 1 on the recommendation list. They also had concerns about modifications to processes, and most of those modifications to processes have been worked out with the deep well planners, so that we're not really modifying our processes very much.
So are you on number 2 now?
I'm on
or
number
is-
2 now, yes, sir.
Okay, let's go back to number 1.
Yes, sir.
So it says a 50% reduction, and I think the original number you showed up there a little while ago was 14,000 plus. So that's the 50% reduction off of that?
This reduction is from the density proposed in the deep well master plan. That's 50% of the
50%
10,500.
of the 10,500.
That's correct.
Okay.
What was the rationale for 50% as opposed to 60, 70, any other number?
Their discussion was any number they pick is arbitrary. They felt the 50% brought them down to a level where the type of development pattern was more closely aligned with what we have nearby.
Yeah, I remember.
I don't know that it wasn't an arbitrary number at 50%.
I remember specifically that Commissioner Messner felt
And
that
so-
a
yes.
number, any number was going to be an arbitrary number.
And it's true, any number would have been an arbitrary number.
And I'll just remind the council that courts don't look favorably on arbitrary government decisions. So take that 50% with a grain of salt. To the extent that this council goes through and decides to reduce their proposed 10,500 by a certain percentage or certain number, you better have a rationale for it.
Yeah, John, I have a question for you. I've heard in various conversations the term taking. What, under what reference does that term come into this conversation?
Well, I would say what it doesn't generally come in is a constitutional taking, because regulatory takings under a constitutional analysis basically require that there's no reasonable use of the property left. So a downzoning in most cases, against the will of the property owner, for instance, is downzoning, let's say from 100 units per something to 50, doesn't usually amount to a constitutional taking. But Arizona has this unique statute, and it's sort of referred to as Prop 207. So any zoning action done by a city against the will of the property owner that reduces the value of that property gives the owner of the property a right to claim, make a claim against the city for that reduction in value, that diminution in value of the property. So it's very fact intensive. That's why whenever we do a rezoning, even if the property owner, and which is most cases, is the applicant for the rezoning, we make them sign what's called the Prop 207 waiver, that you're asking for this rezoning. If so for some reason down the road the rezoning ends up in reducing the value of your property, you've waived any claims against the city. So that's what we have to be careful is if the council approves this master plan or this zoning, and it does something that the developer objects to, does it create a diminution in the property value from what the current zoning is, not from what their proposed zoning is, and that could amount to some sort of claim for damages.
So if the current zoning is theoretically 14,000 residential units in some form, and we all of a sudden say you can only have 5,200, what effect does that have?
I'm going to use the George term. There's a complexity to that, and here's why. Under the current zone, the question is, under the current zoning, how developable is the property? What is sort of the value today of the land under its current zoning, given all kinds of factors, market pressures and all those kinds of things? If in this case, the developer in a sense is asking for somewhat of a downzoning in terms of the number of residential units, perhaps, but a lot of it, there's so many sort of factors that would go into whether basically experts, economists, appraisers would say that the property today under the current zoning is worth X. Under the master plan, it's worth Y. Under the master plan, with a 50% reduction, it's worth it has to be less than X. And so, but that's where I think we need to be cautious about, again, coming up with a reduction that the developer, property owner objects to. We better have a darn good rationale for that and not be arbitrary.
Thank you.
That sort of flies in the face of the concept that we're dealing with, however. There is a request by the property owner to rezone. There is a request by the property owner to have a master plan with a maximum number of units. If at some point the negotiation over the number of units reaches an impasse and the property owner can't live with it, they can withdraw their request. This is a voluntary request on the part of the property owner. So you have the opportunity to negotiate the density down, but if at any point they decide it's too low, they're out. And that gives them the right. That way there's no taking of property. They always have their existing zoning until or unless the city adopts a new zoning for their property.
So
and generally we don't do that over the objection of a property owner.
So theoretically, if they said, all right, we're not going to do this master plan, they could develop according to current zoning.
Yes, they can right now develop according to the current zoning, yes.
So they'd pull the request and,
They could pull the request before you vote on it. They could object to your, I suppose the property owner themselves could refer it.
Well, I think what would happen is, as a practical matter, is there's a motion to approve with the condition that reduces the density from the residents from 10.5 to 7. There's a second, and before there's a vote, we would probably say, developer, do you want to withdraw your application? Because once you vote, then 30 days later the zoning takes effect. At that point, I think the owner would say, yeah, we'll pull. I mean, that's sort of the practical solution. So again, I'm not suggesting that you force any type of rezoning on the owner.
Yeah.
That's over their objections.
So how many current residential units does present zoning allow?
That's the 14,400 some odd that we showed earlier in the review.
Then you get to the water
And again,
issue.
it's a
45.
practicality thing, because that assumes that certain properties will develop to their maximum density, and our properties here almost never develop to their maximum.
But George, going back to the practicality, is water.
Ultimately, as the city manager said, water is the ultimate growth management tool for Prescott specifically, but also a combination of water and development patterns which are market-driven. People do not want to buy into property if its design and its development aren't what they're looking for.
It'd be a total waste of money to design for that much if you know your water's not going to be there.
Again,
So
that's
pragmatically, let's design it for what's realistic, because if you have to go out and buy that water, it's going to cost you a fortune. So what do we have to deal with is really what Jim's been saying all along, whether it's in two phases, whether it's what they have right now and what they're obligated and what their right is to have when the new pipeline comes to play. Is that all the water they're going to have? And if it is, let's design that to the maximum and quit playing the shuffle game.
So we are about to hear from water. Your water resources staff are going to give you a presentation as soon as I click through these next few slides. That's one of the things they will talk to you about, is what is that number? What availability of water is already agreed to with Deep Well Ranches.
And so, George, I just want to make a comment with John Palladini. So if we make a recommendation as a council to a reduction to a certain number based on some facts and such things as water, that's certainly not arbitrary. But that the idea of just cut it in half is pretty arbitrary.
And my suggestion is the same as George's, is that you reach an agreement with the owner / developer to say that, rather than 10.5, here is the number, and get them, on the record to state, yeah, we're good with that number.
Based on some
based on reasons,
rationale.
and rezoning is a little bit of a negotiation. There's give and take. So, what is oftentimes an owner or developer says, well, I'll cut my residential, but I want X. I mean, we heard it the other day, the other month, from a presenter that said, I'll give you this land for airport, but you give me water. I mean, that's kind of the way development works. It's a big negotiation.
I think that we need to, excuse me, Mary, it looks like you were going to talk. I think we need to be careful about talking water to control growth. That's a slippery slope, because on the other side of that, they're saying that in order to reach safe yield, we're going to need to have Big Chino come online. So, be careful what you wish for. You may just get it, kind of a thing. And so, that I just wanted to make that comment. And, in case folks are going, well, gee, then we'll just ixnay the Big Chino Water Ranch, and our problem's solved.
Of the 21, I'll go to Mayor Pro Tem in a moment, but of the 21 conditions or considerations from the P&Z, we just went over the first one. And I know that you told me in the past that some of these have already been worked out with the developer. And so what was have they given us any kind of position on this particular thing?
Yes, they have. I think we attached that to your staff report also. There were some comments from them. One of the things I was going to do is just very quickly point out, for instance, master plans shall comply with land development code within the special plan communities zoning requirements. Any major variation spelled out in the development agreement with the city, this is just basic stuff. This would have to happen no matter what. You have to work out what in a development agreement triggers a major amendment, come back to council with it. You have to follow the city's codes unless there's something specific that modifies the city codes in the development agreement or in the master plan. This is housekeeping. Number 3 is very similar.
Let's go
It
back to
says-
1. I'm not done with 1 yet, okay? I know you want to rush through this, but let's get back to 1.
It's not rushed.
Okay, I just asked you, has the developer come back with a response to number 1?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't believe that
So
they
this
can
is one
reduce
that
by
we haven't-
50%.
We haven't got a response back on.
I believe what they responded back was that 50% doesn't work.
Okay.
Their intention is to deal with the 10,500 they
So
asked
they'll be coming
for.
back with either 10.5 is what we have to deal with, or they might
Or
come
that
back
will
with a
be part
lesser
of their
number or
dis-
something.
That will be part of their discussions with
Okay.
you. Yes.
And we won't know exactly when that agreement is worked out, but probably in the next few weeks, huh?
There have been a number of meetings already working on the development agreement. There are still ongoing discussions at staff level on some of the other topics, so I would expect it's probably approaching a point where it can come back to you for a discussion.
Okay.
One of the things the city manager pointed out, and we had it in our initial outline of the presentation, is that one of the discussions you need to have is, do you want another workshop meeting, a shorter one where I will not be talking, that addresses specifically the development agreement, airport protections, because that's something that's not included in this presentation, and perhaps some of those things that they're proposing to modify in our general engineering standards or design standards. So we think it's important to have you given an opportunity to decide if you want another workshop meeting and to schedule that, and we will have the staff available to go through with you in as much detail as you need to address those things.
Okay, so as we go through these 21, you'll tell us which ones have been resolved with the developer.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem, you had something?
Well, briefly, thanks for pushing some questions there, Steve. Thank you, John, down there, for reminding us we have 2 set of rules that we have to abide to as sworn public officials. One of them's the federal constitution, one of them's the state constitution. And we all swore to uphold both of those and defend them. So I'll just share that with you guys because, you know, you got lots of lawyers lurking everywhere. And it wasn't my inference that we employ, Mr. Blair, water is a growth tool. Water will be a growth tool, but not by us. It's just the way it is. And if we only have so much water to distribute, that's all we've got. That doesn't preclude somebody from going getting water from somewhere else, which we've already evidenced watching other people buy water rights and bringing them to the table. So I'm just bringing that up. Water will be an issue. So thanks.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do 3 and 4, and then we'll go to the public. We're already past 2:30, so.
So city rules, regulations, again, the same concept is that unless it's specifically waived either in the master plan or the development agreement, they follow the city's criteria, development standards, zoning, operational standards. There was a specific request that the Public Works Department talk to you about traffic circulation, specifically relating to the streets and capacity of the streets around the development. That is something that would be a topic of another workshop should you choose to do that. That will take a little bit of additional time. Again, some of that's still going back and forth between the depot planners and our engineering department. You want to stop there, or I can cut through the rest of this and we can get to water? It's
Well-
relatively straightforward.
I think we need to give the public an opportunity. There's a lot of folks out there that came, and I think that, what I would say is if you're going to get up and talk, would you try and not get onto water and density yet? I mean, talking about traffic, because we haven't got to that yet. That still needs to be briefed. And I think until it is briefed, it's probably premature to be trying to spend a lot of time on that. I'd like you to try and make your comment short and relative to what we've talked about already. So first person, come on down.
Bill Goslow, 720 East Willis. I think your comments probably about water just knocked me off the dais. Most of my issue you have, it is about water. It's about creating a hybrid city at Deep Well Ranch. I don't speak out in favor of or opposed to this situation. I'm just trying to help advise you people from my background, which is 35 years as a registered architect in 7 states. 10 of those years, I was the chief estimator for Kaiser Permanente in Los Angeles. I estimated thousands of projects over those 10 years. Everything from replacing a bathroom to replacing an entire building with a building twice as big. So I have experience in this, but this project is a different animal. And what I'm suggesting is that you open your mind to the possibility of building a town that would be standalone electrically and standalone water. I'll let you read the details of this. My contact information is on this. Feel free to use it if you want. Let me show the audience what I'm going to show you. This is the cost of building a hybrid city at Deep Well Ranch. This is the cost to build the Big Chino pipeline, because Deep Well Ranch doesn't use this technology. Now, let me show you this. This is the cost to build a hybrid city. This is Prescott's cost. This is the cost to build the pipeline, the Big Chino water pipeline. And this number comes from page 50 on the 2011 General Plan Committee estimate. It's the closest thing I've found to an accurate estimate. Now let's say I'm low on this side. Let's say I'm low by the factor of 2. 66 million. 196 million. As a taxpayer, I gotta say I'd like to go this route. Let's say I'm low by a factor of 3. Costs 99 million to build this hybrid city. 169 to build the pipeline. Well, let's take it to an extreme. Let's say this hybrid city.
You got 1 minute left.
I'm wrapping it up. Let's say this hybrid city is the same cost, or maybe a little bit higher than the Big Chino pipeline. What you will have achieved is you will not draw water from the Deep Well Ranch as much as you would without it. You will not draw water from the Little Chino Aquifer for this Deep Well Ranch. You will not draw water from the Big Chino Aquifer as much, and you will save for hundreds of years the Verde River.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Next.
My name is Chuck Queen. I live at 5983 Symphony Drive. And what I wanted to speak to more than anything was some of the regulations and how it's going to operate. I definitely am not a city planner, so I don't have and won't even attempt to speak to those issues. Neither will I speak to water issues, as I'm not conversant enough on that. I do want to ask and make sure that the October 2nd master plan is the one we're talking about, because that's the last one I saw posted. And that's what these comments are from. But one of the direct quotes out of that is the general development standards included in this master plan fully amend any city rules, regulations, policies, development standards, and design guidelines, as well as any future modifications or new city rules, regulations, policies, development standards, design guidelines addressing the subject matter of the development standards contained in the code, the city's engineering standards, or city rules, regulations, standards, or policies. That is what is literally in this agreement, this master plan currently. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that and that you're comfortable with the fact that, as some people have said, 4 to 5 decades, the plan itself says 3 to 4 decades, that this will be in effect.
Mr. Queen, I brought that up, and that's what they removed.
It's not removed on the October 2nd.
understand that. That's
The
what-
only one posted, the only one the public can see that is not removed.
Just for clarification, the criteria that's set out in there is still in the plan. That is in effect. What's been changed are those various city codes and criteria have been either modified or removed. So again, if you adopt the master plan and you adopt the DA, you are modifying and you are superseding general city rules as addressed by the master plan and the DA within that area. It doesn't affect anywhere outside of the master plan area, but within that area, that is exactly what you're doing.
The next quote from the master plan, as it is posted, is the master plan administrator should have the sole right or to assign, designate density and intensity requirements, allotments from the budget to individual parcels, lots, or tracts, which basically says it's a general zoning for the area of all the groups, and the plan administrator, master plan administrator, who is from the developer side, does not work for the city, does not owe any allegiance to the city at all, is the one who has the sole right to assign what's going to be built somewhere. You don't. We don't. The next one is, in the event of a conflict between design guidelines and city developed design guidelines or development review standards, the design guidelines shall apply. The master plan administrator may modify the design guidelines during the site plan or subdivision plot process if the proposed modification demonstrate quality design. They can change it. The master plan administrator, single person, non-responsible to the city or citizens, can make a change, but you cannot. Then another one is, as further described in section 41C, these general development standards apply to and control development on the property. That statement is contained in their land use groups, which would typically be your zoning, the design guidelines, the circulation standards, which I took to be traffic engineering, pretty much, landscape standards, grading and grading standards, which would be engineering standards typically, water and wastewater standards.
Got 1
Again,
minute. You got 1 minute.
Okay. I guess I can sum it up. I have several more here, and I'd be glad to hand these to you. They're in it. My 1 minute will be a question to John. There's a development agreement mentioned 35 times in the response to the city comments. Will the public, before any agreement is accepted, whether it be the master plan or the development agreement, since it will modify and can modify the master plan, have a review time on that DA?
We're working on the development.
I know it's not done, which means you can't really vote on a master plan. It's a pig and a poke till you get the development agreement, which it states can modify it. I'm asking whether, when the development agreement is done, will the public get a chance to see it and comment on it?
It'll all be done at a public meeting. It'll all be done
It'll be-
publicly.
Okay, so it will be
Public meeting
published and comment time.
And it'll be posted.
Other thing we-
Okay.
It'll be posted. Yeah.
Thank you.
By the way, Mr. Queen, let me just say that your letter has been distributed to the council, and they have had an opportunity to look at it. Next, please.
Hi, my name's Anna Perez. I live in Prescott Valley. Is it okay if I comment? It'll be quick. It'll be like 2 or 3 minutes. So I was at the P&Z meeting on 9/28, and I took some notes. I do have a background in architecture. I have a master's degree and 13 years experience. So this is very interesting for density reasons. I don't think that number was arbitrary, that 50%. One of the council members, I didn't note who, sort of broke it down. This deep well project is 25,600 acres, is one of my notes. And the density would come to 3,750 dwelling units per square mile, which is 3 times larger than what the density of Phoenix is, and it's 8 times more dense than what Prescott is today. So it wasn't quite as arbitrary as some may have portrayed. And then I have a question for George. When you said when the staff would make a change to lighting or landscape use or mailboxes, would that be in concurrence with the city? Would the city also have a say in that, or would it just be staff? I mean, the city council.
It would depend on the significance and the level of the change proposed. Again, one of the things that we've mentioned to you before is your development agreement will have to have triggers in it as to whether or not this requires a city council action, or can it be handled by your staff. If it's at a level below the trigger, it will be handled by your staff.
Another comment is I appreciate that they finally put the airport so you can see where the airport is and have a more clear picture, because this master plan seems to be a shell game and there's a lot of hidden language, and it really doesn't seem very accessible to the public for them to understand and have comment on. So if you could influence the developers to be more public friendly so that there's more transparency, I think everybody would appreciate that and maybe be more favorable to the project.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Geis? Tom Geis, could you explain to everybody that we're going to be putting all this online, that could be observed there, and when it'll be online?
Yes, Mayor and Council. In fact, we've been putting all of the comments and the information provided to the Planning and Zoning Commission, staff review comments back to the deep well planners online, and we continue to do so every week. So if you go into the city's webpage, www.prescott-az.gov, you'll see under the Spotlight section a link that will take you right to the planning page and additional links to the planning consultants page. So you can find that information in both places.
Okay. And will you update that periodically?
Pretty much every couple of days, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, council, I think most of you know who I am. My name is Sal Ludi. I live at 2206 Loma Rica Circle, Prescott, Arizona, and I represent Deepwell Ranch. But in addition to that, I am a citizen here who has lived in this community for 50 years. And I have experienced and seen development and whatever. But I don't want to get into the details of a master plan or a development agreement. I want to visit you with the history of Deepwell Ranch. Some of those things are important, and how we got to where we are today with respect to the master plan, the development agreement, and what the process was to get there, where we are today.
Sal, could you speak in a little bit more into the mic?
Okay.
I see people back there struggling.
All right. Everybody needs to understand that Harold and Mitzi James, Ron James' aunt and uncle, came here from Wyoming and settled on the Deepwell Ranch, acquired the Deepwell Ranch in the 50s. Okay. They operated the ranch. They also operated a charitable foundation called the Harold James Family Trust, which has provided much for this community over the years in terms of even hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for charitable purposes and functions in this community. But the city of Prescott came to Harold and Mitzi back in 1967 and requested an easement through the ranch for what is now the water line that comes through Deepwell Ranch. Harold and Mitzi granted that. And that is all for the benefit of this community, Deepwell Ranch, and everybody that lives around here in this community.
In addition, they had a unique plan with their estate and whatever. And what that provides, that when they were both gone, they wanted everything, Deepwell Ranch and everything that they owned, to go to this foundation so that the ranch could be continuing to operate as an operating cattle ranch now and in perpetuity. The problem with that was, and this is just a legal problem, the Harold James Family Trust was a non-operating foundation. And when Mitzi James passed away in '07 and we started to deal with those issues, it became apparent that a non-operating foundation could not operate a cattle ranch. So we went to council in Phoenix, my friends at Snow and Wilmer, and I asked them to give me an expert in foundations and what we might be able to do to accomplish the objective and the plan of Harold and Mitzi James. Believe it or not, 2 months ago, after years of discussion and working with the Internal Revenue Service, we received authorization from the Internal Revenue Service to convert the Harold James Family Trust non-operating foundation to an operating foundation, which can now operate the ranch as long as it is involved in really useful charitable activities. That person from Snow and Wilmer, that lawyer, his name is Prescott Pohl, which is probably appropriate for this area, went to work across the country trying to find similar situations where ranches were operated within the confines of a foundation for charitable purposes. He found some of those 2 years ago. A fellow from New Mexico State University that has worked on these things with ranches for years came and visited. He was here last week, as a matter of fact, again. Rob Petrovich will discuss those issues about what those things are in place now, which would permit and authorize the ranch to be operated as a charitable foundation. I want to go into one other thing, hopefully, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to go through the annexation process. This did not happen by accident. The city of Prescott had the vision and the foresight years ago to see that at some point in time, development was likely to occur north of Prescott, north of the Prescott city limits. They approached Mr. James and us, and over a period of years, we discussed the prospect of pre-annexation, which was mentioned by George Worley. That negotiation was together. It really was like a partnership, working together to try to do something that was positive for this entire community. Contained within that pre-annexation agreement, I know you're going to get to talk about water, but I want to bring up, within that pre-annexation agreement, there were 2 allocations of water from the city of Prescott to Deepwell Ranch. The first of which was 900 acres. That is already in place, and some of that property or that water has already been used for development. The second one was 900 acres from the Big Chino, if that ever comes through. But also, we all know, and it was mentioned here several times, particularly by Mr. Lamerson, that doesn't preclude anybody from going after any other water that the city might have over time or over the years, or from other sources. So I just wanted everybody to think about that and remind what the allocation is. So then we continued to discuss annexation, and annexation was approved. And it's been brought up that we have a general plan that's been amended and whatever, but that general plan is in place. And that also was accomplished through negotiation and discussion, and that plan was approved by a vast majority of the voters of this community. So that's kind of how where we got where we are now. And that's where we really started after the annexation to talk about development and a master plan and everything, which we believed is positive and is in the best interest of the city. But it was a result of this partnership between Deepwell Ranch and the city over many years that have kind of come to that decision and that conclusion. So that's kind of how we got here over many years to where we are now. In summary, I just want to say Deepwell Ranch and the city of Prescott really forged a value-added partnership to try to put this together in a very positive form for quality growth. Everything. We're talking about economic development and everything over many, many years. And what we're interested in, and I think the city is interested in, is quality, gradual development with flexibility over a period of years, which is in the best interest of the public, the city, and everyone involved. And we kind of perceive this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the city to build an important part of Prescott from the ground up, as opposed to what might occur under existing zoning, which could result in potential add-on urban sprawl. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sal. Next.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, my name is Rob Petrich, resident of Prescott for 43 years. I have the pleasure of representing the foundation, the James Foundation, also known as the Harold James Family Trust, but locally everybody just calls it the James Foundation. I don't have time to tell you all of the good things the foundation does, how it spends its money, I think you know, but primarily for charitable, scientific, and educational purposes. Foundation can spend that money anywhere. It happens to be a local foundation and chooses voluntarily to help the city of Prescott with its money. As the owner of this property, there's a unique opportunity for the James Foundation to partner with the city of Prescott. Have you ever seen such a large piece of ground, 1,800 acres, in a key strategic area of any city owned by a charitable nonprofit that's going to take its money and use it back in the city? Have you ever seen one owner with 1,800 acres instead of hundreds of owners willing to come to the table with the city and do a master plan? This master plan has been 10 years in the works since the city first approached Mr. James and asked for cooperation for the annexation. It's well planned. It has many community benefits. It has areas for fire stations, for police stations, land donated for schools, not one, but several. That's an interesting point. If James Foundation donates land to the Prescott Unified School District for a new high school, suddenly the school district can relocate the high school and relocate Prescott Middle School to the old high school, opening up the Prescott Middle School downtown for economic development. All of a sudden, the city of Prescott has an opportunity for a downtown convention center. At the time of annexation, the city hired a financial expert to determine the economic benefits of the annexation. That report came back that the annexation would have very positive economic benefits to the city. It's important to keep in mind that the James Foundation owns a ranch, which is an operating ranch. It has 18,000 acres. This development is only for 10% of that, 1,800 acres. That means the remainder, 16,200 acres, stays as an operating ranch operated by this operating foundation. That means that 16,200 acres still has cattle out on it, still is open. When it comes to density, you have to ask yourself, what are we comparing to? The number that the developer came in with was 10,500 units. What does the current zoning allow? We heard today that it was 14,000 units. That obviously is more than what the developer has asked for. Councilwoman Orr, you asked about the exhibit to the council packet. I have it. We can put it on the overhead, but it shows, according to the city, the maximum density is 15,069. So someplace, so the city needs to start comparing apples to apples. What does the current zoning allow, and what is proposed under the master plan? And if that is less under the master plan, then it's not a big number. The bigger number is what's currently zoned. So aren't we in a very unusual situation where we have an owner who is charitable, owns a big piece of property, that's willing to partnership with the city, come to some understanding as to a reasonable density, and then find a way to develop that in a way that makes sense, that is a logical and managed growth plan for the city. We've talked a little bit today about private property rights. Of course, those private property rights are founded in the United States Constitution, which provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That means if you want open space, and the owner owns it, and it's zoned to be used for something else, you got to pay that owner to keep it vacant. You can buy it and keep it vacant, or you can agree to a master plan whereby the owner agrees to keep it vacant. We've talked about the airport. The report from the airport department clearly stated that the master plan is better than the existing zoning for the airport. The only way that it makes economic sense for a ranch to continue on the remaining 16,200 acres is to find a way to develop 10% of that 18,000 acre ranch. The master plan does that. It's a clear cooperation with the city. It started 10 years ago. The foundation is happy and willing to continue to work with the city to make this a reality. It'll be good for the community. It'll be good for the economics. It'll be good for the city of Prescott. And we'll finally have some meaningful additions to the city instead of haphazard 20-acre lot developments that would result in a piecemeal development of this area instead of a managed growth master plan that I think most people appreciate the benefits of. So in closing, I'd just like to suggest that the density is much less under the master plan than as proposed or as allowed under existing zoning. We need city to tell us exactly what that number is. Is it 14,000 or is it 50,000? Maybe it doesn't matter much because we're clearly under that now, but it would be helpful to know what that number is. And then from that point, I think city staff and the developer can work out some number that satisfies both parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take one more and then we're going to close out.
Well, thank you, Mayor, Council. I'm Ralph Hess. I've lived in Prescott for about half the number of years of Sal, so I'll limit my comments to about half the time that he took. I just have a process question. My process question is, in view of the number of citizens and Prescottonians who are interested in this issue, as evidenced by the people who are here in the gallery and I guess the many planning and zoning meetings, has the council considered that once staff and the council has negotiated the best legal alternative as a master plan, of referring this matter to the citizens as a ballot proposition in accordance with the initiative provisions of Chapter 10 of the Prescott City Code, or City Charter, thank you, Article 10 of the Prescott City Charter, and Article 4, Section 1, or Part 1, Section 1, subsection 15 of the Arizona Constitution, so that all of the people can have a voice in determining whether to approve the master plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor,
Come on up, last one.
can I just address that zoning by initiative is illegal in Arizona? In other words, a zoning is a legislative act that's referable. So if the council were to approve a rezoning, the rezoning and development agreement don't take effect for 30 days, within which time those legislative decisions are referable. But the council has to actually act on it and not sort of punt as an initiative to the voters. So I just want to clarify that.
Last one.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Ken Mabarak. I'm at 122 North Cortez, and I am on the Prescott Planning and Zoning Commission. We were hoping to get like a spring break after our 7 hearings on this, but we're going right back into the next semester. I want to say just a couple of things. This was a very detailed process. It took 10 weeks and 7 meetings, and that's just as the public time. Each commissioner, who I want to say did a beautiful job in paying attention to this. We only had one person who was absent one time, and that was at summertime. So, in fact, my wife reminds me we didn't get out of town in August. But they did a very dedicated job, looked into it. This was a very, very, very complex issue, something that we've never seen before. The packet you received is probably half the size of the one we first received. So we went through a lot of details. One of the things that didn't happen, and I'm so proud that nobody did, is we never mentioned the name James family. We looked at this as a piece of real estate, or how does it fit into our town? There's certainly no question that the James family has done great deeds for our community. We have the hospital, we have the nature places, we have lots of things. They're there every time somebody needs a check. They're a wonderful family. That's not the reason you would give them things you may not otherwise want to give. And we looked at this very objectively. So I want to caution our council. I'm hearing the conversation today, and I think this is the preliminary conversation. But I want to caution, this whole thing is not just about density, rather. Density is really an arbitrary number. The market certainly will determine what the density of this project is, both for commercial and residential. I tried not to focus too much in my deliberations on the zoning. But the cautions I want to give to you is there's more details in that general plan than just density. There's details on, for instance, things do come back to Planning Commission, but it's only a site plan review. We don't get to see it if there's something that comes back, and Trevor, maybe you can correct me if I misspeak here, but it doesn't come back to whether that should be residential that they want to put there, or if it should be a hotel where they want to put there. And in some cases, they should have flexibility to move around. As an example, do you want to put a grocery store on that corner or a hotel? I don't know that it matters, unless you've already put some residential next to it. And we looked at it from that perspective, and I think the plan does not require them to come back if there's already been something there. Is that fairly correct, Trevor?
Just as in the existing zoning, yes.
And so what that does come back to us for a site plan review, but not for the zoning. So I want to caution you. The density is certainly one issue, and I don't know how you're going to solve that. We weren't able to solve it. We had great debate. Do we tie it to water? Do we take an arbitrary number? Who knows? I don't know the answer. God love you for figuring it out. But I want to caution you, there's more to this than just density. So thank you for this deliberation today. This was a great 2-hour meeting. I see people back here taking notes. I've never seen our community more passionate. I think it's a good thing. I was on the positive. I was one of the 4 people who voted for it. This vote could have gone either way the week before, and I think some things happened that helped us. But what we wanted to have was cooperation from the developers, and certainly all these 20 or so recommendations, they really followed some of the detail that you may not be getting at this meeting. But thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Mayor, can I just say something to Ken? Ken, I'd just like to thank you for your thoughtful letter that
Thank
that
you.
we got today.
I think that's something we all should be taking a look at. Thank you, Billy.
City Manager, I think we need to have another meeting. We still haven't covered, you know, the airport and water and
Yeah, there's a
traffic
series of
density, so
outstanding issues. I think it's, at this point, maybe appropriate before we adjourn to make the determination, is this body, as it sits here today, going to continue to work on this? And
do they want to continue working on it or punt to the next
Yeah.
one? Is that what you're saying? I think we have a duty to continue to work on this.
I think you do too. And I think
I'd
that's
invite any of the candidates to come and be a part of the audience and find out what's going on.
I think that makes total sense.
So I think there's consensus on the council to continue to work this. Am I correct or not?
I know we don't have a meeting next Tuesday, a regular meeting.
Yeah.
But I think a special meeting from 1 to 3 to go over this again is
Yep.
probably a good thing.
Good idea.
Everybody agree? All right.
Okay. We'll plan on making that happen, and we'll start with the water topic.
I would definitely like to have a meeting on the development agreement.
Yes. And that'll probably also include a executive session prior, at some point, I would think. Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for coming, everybody. And like I said earlier, this is a very important subject, and I appreciate your interest and concern. And we'll have our next meeting, I think, on 7 November. Is that correct, City Manager?
Yes, that would be correct.
Thank you. Meeting adjourned.
Election.